In this video, I'm going to provide a brief overview of the stages of second language acquisition. And to start, I just want to again situate this in the can-do perspective. So as you read about in this week's content, the can-do perspective is the idea that we approach second language learners or multilingual learners through the lens of what they can do, and then think about their next areas for growth, rather than approaching them in terms of what they cannot yet do, which unfortunately too often is the way that students are approached, especially multilingual learners who are learning English as a new language at school. So thinking about what students are already capable of, and then how we can support them to get to that next stage. So the stages of SLA have traditionally been broken into 5 stages. Here you see in the green text, the words that were originally used when Krashen and Terrell proposed 5 stages. And WIDA has adopted this 5-stage framework and added kind of stage 6 being reaching or at proficiency. So I've kind of mapped onto how the WIDA stages more or less fit with these 5 stages that you see from early SLA literature. So the first stage of second language acquisition is often referred to as the silent period or pre-production. WIDA calls this entering. And during this period, a student might not talk at all. And the stage can last as short as 1 minute. A student might come into a classroom and immediately begin trying to produce language, or it could last as long as 6 months. It also is a stage in which students are still developing language. So during this stage, students might develop anywhere from 1 to 500 words, although that language might be receptive, meaning it's words that they understand. They're not necessarily producing them. The learner is still acquiring language and developing that understanding. So during this stage, again, to think about what the learner can do, the learner, because the learner has some receptive language, they can point to things, they can act things out, they can match, they can label, they can respond to yes and no questions. So there's a lot that the learner can do, even if they're at a stage where they're not yet producing language in the target language. We then move into early production, what WIDA would call in their second stage, emerging. And here we see that the learner has developed more language and some productive language as well. So approximately 1,000 words at this stage. The learner is often in this stage between 6 months to a year after beginning to learn the language. And at this stage, the learner can begin to produce 1 or 2 word responses, some short phrases. So they're beginning to produce language. From then we move to speech emergence, when the learner starts to produce a lot more language. And this is usually after 1 to 3 years of learning in that language. So here the student has developed about 3,000 words. And we see students using full sentences, maybe making grammatical errors, but they're producing full sentences in the language. So that's speech emergence or developing. We then move into intermediate fluency, or what I would align with kind of WIDA's levels 4 expanding and 5 bridging, where the students are developing quite a bit of language. They have about 6,000 words in their vocabulary or more. This is after they've usually been learning the language for 3 to 5 years, and students are beginning to produce more complex sentences. They're speaking more at length. And so at this stage, a lot of students are exited from being considered English learners and no longer receive EL services. So they're kind of moving into a stage where they are reaching or getting closer to reaching grade level proficiency. And finally, we have advanced fluency, or what WIDA 6 calls reaching, which is when the student has developed 6,000 to 10,000 plus words. And this can take, again, for some students as short as 4 years, but for many as much as 10 to begin to develop kind of that grade level near native fluency or proficiency in the language. So this gives you a sense for what that development looks like. Of course, all students are different and may move through these stages at different paces, but more or less we see that students tend to go through these periods. And one thing that's really important to point out is just how long it can take to acquire grade level proficiency in a language, to be able to navigate that language at school. And so again, we think back to how Cummins' idea of Bix and Kelp and what he was really trying to do, which was show that just because a student only has conversational language, if they've been learning the language for 2 years, it doesn't mean that they have a learning disability, right? We know that the process of language acquisition takes time. And if a student is not talking right away, that also doesn't mean that there's something that they have some sort of cognitive challenge. We know that the silent period exists, and for some students, it exists for quite some time, right? That they could be up to 6 months just absorbing the new language. So this just gives you some ideas of what the learner can do and also the time frame that it takes. It's also important to, again, remind ourselves that we acquire language across 4 domains, right? We acquire both receptive and productive language, oral and written language. So we acquire language by listening, for reading, and then productive is speaking and writing. So all of this language acquisition is happening in these different domains as students are learning at schools, not just in one domain like speaking. It's also important to remember that we are acquiring more than just vocabulary when we're learning a new language. Students are acquiring language simultaneously at multiple levels. So even at level 1, when students are just, it may be in a pre-production silent period and just kind of taking in new words, they're not just acquiring words, they're acquiring sentence level structures, discourse level structures, even if they can't produce that yet. And even if at level 2, they're just producing 1 or 2 word utterances, they're coming to understand how sentences are structured and how we put together more complex texts, right? Through their interaction with other students, with the teacher, with texts. So we can't just focus on, for example, giving our level 1 students who are at levels 1 and level 2, giving them vocabulary sheets to memorize, because that's not very helpful, because language acquisition doesn't just happen first with words, then to sentences, then to discourse. All of these are happening simultaneously, even if they're just manifesting as a single word, right? Just like what we learned with first language acquisition, a child might produce 2 words, but that might mean a whole sentence, right? They might say, mommy, milk, but that means, mommy, I want milk. Right, so there, even the short utterance has a full sentence of meaning behind it. And this is another way of looking at that, showing a bit more detail that we acquire language simultaneously at multiple levels. And so here you see the WIDA performance definitions for speaking and writing, and it shows that for each of these different levels, students are developing linguistic complexity in discourse, right? So they're starting to see how ideas are organized and put together. They're starting to understand the way in which sentences become structured to make meaning. They're starting to develop vocabulary. So this gives you a nice 1-page visual of that. And so I wanted to end by thinking about, okay, so how is this applied to teaching? How can we take this understanding of the stages and apply it to pedagogy? So just one example, because you will go deeper into this topic for those of you who take the methods classes in the TESOL BDL program, you will spend a lot more time diving into the how. But just to give everybody a taste of it, when you think about these levels, it's a really great way then to think about how you're differentiating so that all students can access the content and engage with the content, even if they are at different stages of second language development. So here I'm especially thinking about TESOL classrooms and bilingual education classrooms, although even for world language contexts, you're thinking about the content students are learning as well, although your focus tends to be very specifically on the language. But for example, if I'm teaching in a second grade classroom and I want all of my students to be able to to be able to explain the process of photosynthesis, I might have students who are at these different levels of English language proficiency, but all of them can engage with that objective, right? So for students who are at level 1, I might take a look at some of the resources that I shared with you on Brightspace, and I might think about, okay, what can they do? What can they do with language to be able to access this? So I know they can label. So maybe I'll provide an image of a plant, and you can see the image there, the sun, water, and I'll give them some words and have them label the different parts of the process, right? And maybe with those words, I would also provide a visual that start to have them labeling and mapping that process. For students at level 2, who are in early production or emerging English language proficiency, I might provide them with some sample sentences and have them just fill in one word response, and also do some labeling. So there's a visual, they can first do that and then fill in some sample sentences with those words. For students at level 3, now it's speech emergence or developing, I might have them write a full sentence to explain what happened and give them some supports for that. And finally, for students at levels 4 and 5, getting into that intermediate fluency, expanding, bridging, I might have them write full sentences without providing as many supports. Maybe I'll still have them label a diagram that's helpful for second graders in general, but I'll have them then use the words they've learned to write full sentences without giving some of those sentence frames. So you can see how learning about these different stages can then help us make really strategic differentiation decisions, so that students who are currently at levels 1 and 2 are not just given an alternative activity. They're not just given a coloring sheet to fill out while everybody else is learning about the process of photosynthesis and how to explain it, but finding ways for every student to get different language support so they can engage with the same content goal. And that's really what the stages help us to do when we apply them to pedagogy. So I hope that was helpful, and I look forward to continuing to engage with this content with you in Brightspace.